So we're back for part 2 of Siva's episode.
We absolutely are. A lot of, there's just too much information in part 1, right? So we split it into 2, and the second one is just as, if
Juicy.
not more. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. But we talk a little bit about a couple of different things in the second part, right? And one of them is the fact that, he's going to build this new practice down in Naples, right? Which is super, super exciting. I don't think you could think of a better guy to go do that, put the structure in place to essentially change the dynamic of care.
Yeah, a special type of practice.
Absolutely. And I think it's I shouldn't even say following in the footsteps, because he is, essentially creating this new paradigm. But we're seeing guys start to do this, right? For motion surgery centers specifically, Dr. Slatiki's starting to do it, and Dr. Kachitarian. You're getting these other centers that are kind of starting to specify in this function of it. And he's going down to essentially build a new care model, a value-based care model that's, looking at the things that are most important for care, driving better outcomes, driving better value, for the surgeons, for the patients, for, payers as a whole. And I think that's he will probably be a front runner in that category. And I think he's going to create something very, very special. But a huge component of what I think that practice is going to be motion preservation surgeries, right? Yeah. Because he is essentially, what he's looking at is, how do we not drive, better care in the 3-month, 6-month, 1-year timeframe, but in the 5-year, 10-year? Yeah. How do we get patients back to essentially doing what they're doing, get them back sooner, but improving that quality of life, right? So getting them not to 70% of their threshold of what they were before, but getting them back to their employers, getting them back to labor work, right? And he's looking at all the right metrics to make that happen. So the fact that, he's leaving this well-established practice that he has up here at Jefferson, which he's done a fantastic job at, to create this new practice down in Naples, I think is very, very exciting.
I agree. And there's no one better to explain it than Siva himself. So let's get into it.
Let's jump in. So I pulled some of the slides of work you've done in the past. I think there are a couple of topics, and we've touched actually on a couple of them already. But there's a couple of topics that I think are fascinating. And if you're willing to, I'd love to talk through some of these concepts. Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about the image that you see here on the screen? And Dolly is the technology, correct?
Yeah. Right. So like most of us, when ChatGPT came out, I was playing around with like the different versions of it. And there's one that maybe people don't know of as much called Dolly. I think there's newer versions now where basically you can put in a text prompt and then it will generate an image. And you can be as specific as like make it look like an oil painting, or make it like more abstract, make it cartoony. So I put in this prompt, which is to say, create a depiction of what it feels like to go through the maze that is healthcare, like as a patient, right? And it gave like 5 or 6 different like outputs, and one of them is the one that we're looking at. And I was like, oh, this is the logo for our research group now.
It's unbelievable. I saw it and I was like, it's perfect.
Like this is the problem that like I want to make a small dent in solving. And I feel like everyone, and that doesn't even matter whether you're homeless or whether you're a billionaire, at some level you still feel like this. You might have your own personal physician, concierge medicine, and be like a CEO tycoon. But if that person recommends, maybe you go see this person and maybe you might need this treatment, they're still going to have anxiety on both polar opposite ends of the spectrum of like socioeconomic status, right? Like that's how far reaching this like anxiety is about like the maze. So yeah, that's what that came from. And I it was just the sad irony is that Dolly generated image doesn't look that far apart from like the journey mapping data visualizations that we actually did for patients that ended up getting spine surgery. So that's what that is.
Well, if there's anything AI is for, that is what it's for, right? Yeah. I mean, you're right. Like I look at that and go, yep, that's how it feels.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah.
And the reason I love this too, and the topic that you just brought up, which I think is fascinating, and I don't know if it exists anywhere else, is, you've talked about kind of this veil of medicine, or this veil of care, right? And if you want to, make a dichotomy about it, right? Whether you're homeless on the street or a billionaire living in, wherever with 5 houses, this is kind of what it feels like to get care. And it's really interesting. And I know you've talked about this before too, but there isn't really another industry where that's the case, right? Where you can't get objective, to some extent, reviews on what you're getting into or where you're supposed to go, right?
Right.
If you want to go buy a phone, there's 1,000 different things you can go check at the store. You can look at reviews online. If you're going to go look at cars, you're going to test drive everything, right?
Yeah. Right.
You don't walk into a lot, or very few people do, and say, that's my car, I'm taking it out. You don't look at a house online, again, very few and far between, and say, I'm living there, right? You go inside, you see how it feels, you get reviews. Any product you're ever going to buy on Amazon, why do we like Amazon? It comes really, really fast, but there's reviews on everything, right? And that's why we like Google. But we don't see that in healthcare.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know of a way or how we get around, and I think some of it is these objective data measures, right? But right now, there isn't metrics or measurements that are objective, whether you're looking for a surgeon or a hospital system, right? There's not a good place you can go. And to your point of, my mom needs a hip replacement, who is going to give her the best value, like essentially the best outcome at the lowest cost?
Well, not only that, like what's being used. Because it's like what's going into my body. That's hard to find.
Yeah. It's like a lottery. Like I hope it's the right thing.
And then it's subjective again of like what the surgeon likes in their hands.
Right.
And there's so much, we've had a lot of conversations in the past of like, so much of it is about the anatomy of the patient too. Of like, one device might be good for one patient, but a different one is better for another. And it kind of depends on like, well, does the surgeon just always use this one because they like it? But is that really what's right? Like there's so many layers to it. I feel like.
Yeah, no, I think the whole ranking topic is fascinating. Because if you think about like, okay, let's play out that scenario. My aunt needs a hip replacement. Say she lives in Chicago, and she knows that her nephew is a physician. So let me ask him. So what am I going to do? First thing I'm going to say is, all right, well, who do I know in Chicago? Maybe it's a spine surgeon. I can ask the spine surgeon who's like the go-to person for a hip replacement, right? Okay, that's nice. My aunt's lucky that she has a family member that can do that. But then the question is, am I actually getting to the right answer for her? So I ask my spine surgeon friend in Chicago, and then he or she asks around or knows and says, yeah, it's like John Smith. Well, how do we know that John Smith is the best? What does the best mean? Is it because he's the busiest? Is he the busiest because he's the best? Or is he the busiest because he has loose indications and he operates on everyone? Oh, he's really fast. Is he fast because he's cutting corners, or is he fast because he's really efficient and doesn't have any wasted steps? And so all of that, it remains to be seen, even in this, if you have that insider knowledge or you have like a contact in the medical field, you still might not be arriving at the so-called best choice. And what the best choice is might also be different for different people. Like maybe my aunt, if you ask her to pick, she would say, I just don't want to have another surgery after this one. This has got to be it. And so in that case, like reoperation rates for preventable reasons might be the thing that she cares about most. For somebody else, it might be length of stay, or I only want it if I can do it, if I can get it done in a surgery center because I hate hospitals because my relative had a bad experience and died in a hospital, whatever it is, right? Like everyone has a different set of metrics that matter to him or her. And we don't have the ability to assess physicians, any providers, practices, or hospitals on the metrics that matter to a given patient. And I'm not saying that we have to have every possible metric, but even like a buffet of metrics where a patient or a family can go in and say, well, we care about these three things the most. Give us an understanding of where the different practices and providers stack up on these three metrics of the 10 that are available in my region, right? That doesn't exist right now. So what do you do if you don't have like a nephew who's in healthcare? You maybe look at online ratings. Online ratings kind of stink because it's like, there's a negative bias. Like surgeons, it's like the necessary evil. We kind of manage our online ratings, make sure to sort of send a link to people who we know did well. And, if anyone didn't do well, God forbid, we hope they don't write a review.
Yeah. But that's, that's what you do. You typically don't write a review when things go well. You only write it when you're upset.
If you're doing well, you kind of go on with your life and you're not thinking about it anymore. And sometimes it's because like the coffee was cold and the experience was bad, which is an important thing. but maybe that may or may not be in the control of the surgeon, right? So online ratings, I think we all agree, are sort of like a very imperfect solution. And then there's, US News and World Report, right? Where I was shocked even when I was applying for jobs and I would visit places like Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard, or, these like esteemed institutions, and they would have the huge banner up in their lobby and it would say like #2 for neurology and neurosurgery, US News 2024, or honor roll, or whatever it is. And I remember thinking to myself, let's take Harvard, for example. Maybe, I don't know of any institution in this country that has a better brand reputation than Harvard. And yet they are putting up this huge banner saying they're number 3 in neurology and neurosurgery for US News. So it doesn't matter who you are, you want that ranking and you're going to show it proudly. And if you really look into what goes into a US News ranking, I mean, let alone for colleges, that's like a whole nother topic. It's some combination of like NIH research dollars for the research rankings and getting residency program directors to vote on other institutions. And I mean, I'm not saying there isn't some truth to it. I'm not saying it's like a random list, but it's not diagnosis specific. It's not procedure specific. And it's not specific. You can't dial in to the kind of things that matter to you, right? And, HSS Rite Fellowship, amazing place. It's like number 15, 15 years in a row, or maybe more. I'm probably underestimating, of being number 1 for orthopedics in the country, which is amazing. But there are, I'm sure, a lot of community surgeons out there in the country that are doing incredible work that aren't getting recognized because maybe they're not part of an institution that gets ranked, or whatever the case may be. And so this, maybe the paper that I've published that I'm the most proud of probably is this one where we said, okay, what would we want a ranking system to look like if we were a patient or a provider? And based on the information that we have readily available. And so let's take patient-reported outcomes. Let's take lumbar fusion. And what can we do with this information? So what we said is, okay, let's take what at that time was called the QOD, the Quality and Outcomes Database, which is a national consortium of institutional prospective outcomes registries. And let's take the 15 to 20 top contributing clinical sites to this national registry. And what we want to do is we want to take all the major patient-reported outcomes for surgeries that happened for lumbar fusion surgeries, and be able to create a risk-adjusted ranking on those patient-reported outcomes, ranking both the surgeons and the sites where they work. And so it was a pretty interesting process. We worked with the Vanderbilt Biostatistics group to do some high-end like analytics work. But we essentially were able to do in the end is say, okay, pick the patient-reported outcome that matters most to you. And that includes things like just satisfaction, as in 1 year after surgery, what is the probability that the patient is going to look back and say, yeah, if I could do it all over again, I would do it, right? Which may be the single most important metric out there for elective surgery. And so we were able to say, okay, we're going to rank every surgeon at every one of these 20 sites against each other in a risk-adjusted way on these individual metrics for a particular surgery, which in this case was lumbar fusion. And we didn't publish like the actual rankings as to who's number 3 or number 5. It's obviously de-identified. But what we wanted to do is show is that there is a methodology that exists to be able to do this in a risk-adjusted way. And what we saw was that there was incredible variation across sites, but also across surgeons within a given site.
Wow.
Because we were asking the question, what matters more? Does it matter more whether you go to Hopkins versus Harvard? Or does what matters more like which surgeon you choose at that institution? And we saw significant differences in different patient-reported outcomes too. So it wasn't that like one surgeon was just flying colors on everything, which means everyone has something to learn too. So our motivation for this was, one, to say, what would it look like? Does that methodology exist to be able to do this sort of ranking? Can we risk adjust in a way that passes muster for any surgeon? Because what surgeons are going to say is, hey, look, like Bob's patients and my patients aren't the same. Yeah. Bob's operating on young, healthy patients, all private insurance, in the best zip codes in town. I'm taking care of the disaster situations. And my reoperation rate is going to be higher because I'm the one taking on these big challenges, right? So, which is a very fair point. So you have to, that's what I mean by risk adjustment, is to say, okay, what are the things that we know affect outcomes or cost? Patient-specific factors, diagnosis-specific factors, socioeconomics. Let's control for those things and then look at the ranking. And the idea we had was not to get fixated on who's number 2, number 3, but let's look at the positive outliers and figure out what are they doing differently than everyone else. Maybe that involves a site visit, watching that person in surgery, maybe watching that patient in clinic, to figure out how they're doing patient selection, and then disseminate those best practices to everyone else so everyone gets better. And that's like the notion of this, like a learning healthcare system, which the Institute of Medicine put out years ago, but I don't think has really been operationalized in our field very well. So that's the idea behind that paper. And I think something like that has got to exist, and it can't just be outcomes. It's got to include cost as well and be like a value ranking. So that's what I want for my aunt. I want her to be able to go online, almost like Yelp, when you can filter for the kind of things that matter to you, and the kind of outcomes, and based on whatever your insurance plan is or whatever your employer is, it looks at the estimated cost and it gives you an idea of like what you're signing up for. And it's going to be an imperfect solution, but we all deserve kind of like what I call like a consumer reports for health, for specialty care.
Yeah.
That's I think there's so much opportunity there.
You talk about some of those outcome metrics for those surgeons and variability between surgeons. I want to jump into these slides that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And it's on the cost side of things,
right.
But the same thing as the variability between centers, the variability between surgeons.
Right.
And then I love your concept of we essentially all have something to learn or all have something to teach.
Right.
So some guys might, they might have great operative time, right?
Yep.
Really low operative time.
Yep.
Other guys might be value-based guys, right? Get their costs way down.
Right.
Other guys might, get lower blood, whatever that is. Everybody's got something, and then it's going to be this kind of learning model, right? Where we pick these components and say, well, how does he do this?
And
how does surgeon B do this? And how does surgeon C do this? And create this model, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to talk through kind of some of these costs in your study here.
Thanks for bringing this up. So going back to that time-driven activity-based costing methodology, what we're seeing here is like a dashboard that I created with my research team based on this time-driven activity-based costing method as applied to operating room costs at Thomas Jefferson Neurosurgery. And just to give you a tour of this figure, each bubble or each circle is an individual surgeon. The size of the circle, it represents their case volume over the last 5 years. So essentially, over the last 2 years, I built this software layer that can sit on top of a major electronic medical record like Epic, and that can extract all the data elements from the medical record and from outside the medical record to then generate these time-driven activity-based costing estimates. And then afterwards, you can generate these data visuals. And this is like one proof of concept of that.
Oh my gosh. Do you sleep?
It's a fun project. And like one of my hopes is that this kind of methodology that we can scale and deliver to individual practices, ASC owners, and health systems, around the country eventually, so that everyone has access to this kind of information, so they can, take action based on it. Yeah,
it's phenomenal.
But so for a tour of this, so each circle is a surgeon. The diameter of the circle corresponds to their case volume specifically for one-level ACDFs over the last 5 years. On the y-axis is the total intraoperative cost as measured by this TDABC methodology. And then each section on the x-axis is an individual hospital within the Thomas Jefferson Health Network. So as you can see, just at first glance, there's incredible variation in the average one-level ACDF costs across sites, but also across surgeons within a given site. And you can tell that sometimes, or more often than not, the busier surgeons tend to be lower cost. And we just published a paper on that. It just got accepted, where we looked at that particular question specifically around whether case volume is an independent predictor of total operative cost when you adjust for everything else. But my takeaway from this slide is, how can there be this much variation on a seemingly homogeneous procedure type in one health system, and even within a given hospital in a health system? So that's sort of the takeaway there. And so this one is just trying to simplify things and say, let's just look at OR time, because it's obviously the first word, and time-driven activity is costing. One level ACDF, this is all surgeons at Jefferson Health that do above a certain bare minimum of case volume of this procedure, just one level ACDF over the last 5 years. And it's minutes on the vertical axis. So you have a surgeon that averages about 2 hours of, and this is door in to door out time. And someone else that averages
Patient
about
door in to door out?
Yeah. And someone else averaging about 4 hours, right? Now, this is where surgeons will say, well, look, I don't control turnover at my hospital. I was there ready to go, or the anesthesiologist took a long time, or I'm at the university hospital and they have student SRNAs that are learning, so if the patient needs an arterial line, they're practicing. That's part of it, right? So all that understood, but 4x, or in this case, 2x for the time variation is incredible. And that's just purely time. It's not even total cost.
Yeah, it's just snowballs again of like, how can you even really predict how much time something's gonna take when you have such a variation? Even just, okay, how much OR time?
Block utilization,
yes,
which
exactly.
Hospital administrators care about. Even more so, I would say, is that we know bundled payments are coming, even if it's a procedure-based bundle. Or a hospital system wants to do a direct contract with an employer and wants to be the preferred provider for all their employees' musculoskeletal needs, right? And you're at the negotiating table with the employer trying to figure out what's the bundled payment price going to be for an ACDF, right? Well, if you have this much variability, how do you determine what the right price is? And maybe the right answer is to have a sliding scale bundled payment. But to do that, where you say, okay, you know what? There's broadly 3 types of patients that we're taking care of: the super sick patient, the super healthy patient, and then in between. And what we want to negotiate is a sliding scale where we get paid a little more to take care of these complicated patients because we don't want to cherry pick. And the employers also want those employees to get good healthcare as well. You still need this kind of information to be able to do that stratification.
But you still kind of end up with that subjectivity problem of like, does everyone end up being that, somehow turn into that patient that's more expensive?
Yeah.
Like you still have
right.
that
It's not all objective.
or like,
yeah, totally. So this slide is total cost of care. So this is everything added up together. And you have a high volume surgeon that averages about just under $5,000, and you have some surgeons that are about $9,000. And again,
insane.
To your guys' point, we're not talking about multi-level fusions.
This is one level.
It's one thing if it was for a diagnosis. They're like, okay, certain surgeons choose a more expensive surgery than others. It's for a specific surgery. And so the question we asked then is, and this is really credit to this New England Journal paper that came out a few years ago where they did this for total joints. Well, let's drill down. Like, what are the explanations for this variation? And so what we did then is we said, okay, let's break it down into 2 big buckets, which is supply costs and personnel costs. So this is now looking at supply costs. And again, each circle is an individual surgeon, but now on the y-axis, we actually have a ratio. So it's not the absolute numbers, just to give you an idea. So on implant costs, that top circle, that surgeon is almost 3 times the national average when it comes to implant costs for this procedure. And everyone else is kind of sort of clustered there. Some people are below average, some people are up to 2 times as much. But we're looking at consumables. So that's things like the bipolar, or sterile towels.
Okay.
Or one surgeon might want that expensive bipolar that works a little better, and that sort of thing.
So this could be just so I fully understand, because you say implant, but it's just anything that you're using in the room. So like the person at the top could just be using a lot more stuff and more expensive stuff.
Now in this, for one level ACDF, what we thought was that because we're saying one level, every surgeon should be using 4 screws, 1 plate, and a spacer, right? But there's still variation. And the other thing is, people might say, well, maybe surgeon X is using, a really expensive implant. Okay, sure. But a lot of these health systems have capped pricing. like, right? Where it's like for a certain category of implant, there's only one price, you know? So now maybe someone's using an expandable cage versus a static cage, or someone's using structural allograft, really cheap compared to a cage. So that's where some of this is coming in. But then on the sterilization costs, that is a direct proxy for essentially how many trays, pans, and individual instruments are opened on the back table. Because everyone's dealing pretty much with the same sterilization costs at one health system. And so this is where you can see, okay, surgeon X probably hasn't standardized things, or they're dealing with a very variable patient population, and 3 times as many trays and instruments are being opened up. And then medications is literally, we looked at, okay, propofol. How much does Jefferson pay for a vial of propofol? How many vials got used in each case that surgeon did? So that's how granular we got with the medications.
Wow.
And so that's supply costs. We said, okay, well, let's just look at implants. There's still a lot of variation. What's the explanation? I think that's the next slide. We drilled down into, with personnel even, to say, all right, this surgeon has an RNFA, a PA, and a fellow to do this case. Somebody else is doing it on their own. Okay, that's the difference. Radiation tech time. So if you're using a lot of X-ray, obviously that's not good for anyone, but that also affects the radiation tech's time, and that's a cost as well. So this gets into the idea of how can you make this surgery lean and do it with the least amount of personnel possible, and implants or supply costs possible, while achieving the outcomes that matter. So this is a sort of a fun slide. It's very busy, but it was essentially the idea of let's create an imaginary surgeon that makes the lowest cost choice across each dimension. So the lowest cost implants, the lowest personnel profile, the fewest consumables, the fewest number of trays, and project out what the total cost of care would be for that imaginary surgeon's one-level ACDF. And then let's compare that to the system average that we have at our institution. What's the difference in the cost between that imaginary ACDF and the system average? And if you just multiply that by, say, 80 cases, what are the cost savings to the institution for that? And 80 cases is, if you look at a year, is a really small, it's underestimating what it is, but it's almost, $270,000 of savings just from that alone. Now,
For
obviously,
one surgeon.
Well, if every surgeon made the least expensive choices across every dimension, and you applied those cost savings across 80 cases, what are we talking about? And it's a lot of money. And then the question becomes, well, what if this was for anterior posterior lumbar fusion,
That was
T10
my
to pelvis? What if it was for a diagnosis? I mean, that's almost scary, the amount of cost variation that would be there. But this is the sort of rationale that you can, or the sort of argument you can make to the CFO of a health system to say, hey, look, if we can, you got to put some investment into this with data infrastructure and things like that. But here's what you might be able to get on the back end in terms of improving your margins. So that was the purpose of that sort of calculation. Obviously, that imaginary ACDF may not be a very good result, right? And that's why you need to measure the outcomes as well. But just the theoretical exercise of how much runway do we have here? Perfect segue there is, I don't think this type of visualization has been done in the spine world before. I think it's been done referencing back to that New England Journal article for total joint replacement. But what I said is, okay, this is before our prospective outcomes registry was launched. But thanks to Jim Harrop and the rest of our spine division's credit, there were a couple patient report outcomes that they were collecting. One of them was the neck disability index. So I said, okay, we're looking at ACDFs. Neck disability index is a pretty reasonable metric. Let's calculate the average 3-month improvement in NDI for every surgeon doing one-level ACDFs over the last 5 years. That's the y-axis of this plot. The x-axis of this plot is the average intraoperative cost for that same surgeon. And again, each bubble is a surgeon. So what you want to be a surgeon in the top left quadrant. You want your average neck disability index improvement scores to be high, and you want to be low cost. So you want to be in the left part of the x-axis. You don't want to be in the bottom right, where your neck disability index scores are not great and you're high cost, right? This is a actual value-based visualization of surgeons in a given practice. And this is what rankings should be based on, right? Pick your outcome, look at the costs, And if you did this for procedures, that's great. But what would be really interesting is if you replace the title of that slide with value-based comparison of surgeons for cervical radiculopathy. Pick a diagnosis. Now, if you're a surgeon that does foraminotomies whenever it's indicated and gets the equivalent outcomes to the ACDF, your cost average is going to be severely less and your outcomes might be just as good. So now you're getting rewarded for choosing the least invasive, least costly treatment, not simply getting rewarded for the surgery that pays you the highest in collections or RVUs. And in fact, you might look good if you do no surgery at all and the patient gets better.
It's really interesting too, a little bit of like, if you're looking at your colleagues or your peers, and you're like, where am I sitting on this?
Yeah.
It makes you think a little of like,
totally.
how am I? And that bias we were talking about earlier, that's just that natural of like, well, there's incentives here to do certain things that are just kind of naturally happening around me. And so I'm playing the game as well. This makes it very clear of, you can no longer justify that in your head as much. Right?
And the funny thing is surgeons are naturally competitive.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, that's, you have to be to even just get where you are.
And so it's like this is maybe a bad phrase, but it's like, don't hate the player, hate the game sort of thing, right? Where I think it's the job of people who care about this to set the game rules correctly. What are we being assessed on? And if this is what we're being assessed on, then the players, the surgeons, everyone will act accordingly, and everyone's competitive. So you can imagine, as soon as I started showing some of these plots to my partners,
I'm so curious.
The first thing they ask is, "All right, which bubble am I?"
Yeah.
And
did you tell them?
Oh, yeah, I told them, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, so interesting." And then they start, everyone starts asking questions about. So that rep told me that implant really is like just as expensive as, or just as cheap as structural allograft. But now I really want to know. I'm going to follow up with them because it affects this kind of thing. And
that's fantastic.
If this is not just for the procedure, but for the diagnosis, then surgeons will be rewarded for only doing something when they know or they feel confident that it's going to lead to a good outcome, and not doing it if they're concerned that it's not going to lead to a good result, which I think most ethical surgeons do that, but we're not rewarded for that sort of mentality. We're only rewarded right now in most situations for how much we do.
If you look at this and the surgeon isn't just looking at fusion because that's what I get paid for, all of a sudden I feel like patients get more options put on the table for them.
Yes. I'm
which
so glad you brought that up.
Huge.
Yeah. And so let's say we take lumbar spondylolisthesis, a common diagnosis, the number one diagnosis for which patients get lumbar fusions right now. And we did this sort of analysis with outcomes and cost. But let's say we zoomed out and we were measuring costs over a 5-year or 10-year span. And we're measuring outcomes with respect to, did they have to get another operation? And were they able to go back to work? And to what level were they able to go back to work in, right? If you did that and you did it over a 5-10-year time span, I'd put so much money on the fact that, for example, the Modus procedure through 3 spine that we know and love, or other examples of tried and true motion preservation techniques would be superior to fusion over the right timescale with the right metrics. And let's just take Modus, for example. Let's say we fast forward into the future. Modus is approved. It's being used in the United States. And say it's been in the market for 10 years. And we've been collecting true cost data. And I don't just mean intraoperative cost data now, because who knows what the Modus implants are going to cost in a given location, but true costs to the payer or the employer over a 10-year time span. So if the patient got a reoperation for adjacent level disease, that's part of the cost calculation.
Yep.
If the employee couldn't go back to work because of the activity restrictions of the fusion, that's a cost to the employer as well. Now, over a 10-year time span, Modus is probably going to blow a TLIF out of the water. And the outcomes may be equivalent or better. But you're only going to reveal that benefit of Modus if you're doing cost tracking and outcomes tracking over a 5-10-year span. And you're not just looking at the DRG payments or whatever else is, but you're looking at the costs to the people who matter most here. So like, who's the customer, right? The customer is either the patient or the employer. And for them, this stuff matters. And so that's the kind of thing where I think you have to measure the right things to be able to reveal the true benefits of innovation. And right now, we're not measuring those things in the right way, at the right time scale. And so things that we know intuitively to be the future may not look like it at first glance.
For a long, long time, right? You take it way back and you ask people like, what do you want, right?
It's a Henry Ford quote.
Absolutely, right? Do you want a faster horse or do you want a car, right? And we're in a place where for a long, long time, it's like, I want a faster horse. I want a better cart that rolls better. When the truth of the matter is, there is now a car available, right? Or we're on the precipice of that happening, right? But the problem is, we don't know what exists or what that long-term metric looks like.
Or how to measure it. And like you doing this and like this makes it more clear that the cart doesn't work. You know, we're not getting as far as we thought we were. We're circling instead of like moving forward.
Totally. Yeah. And this is why, I do a fair amount of endoscopy, which I'm passionate about. And one of the reasons is that there are certain situations where you can avoid a fusion by doing an endoscopic decompression because it's less destabilizing. But right now, surgeons don't get paid much to do endoscopy. And if you have a choice between doing, you have equipoise, it's reasonable. You could do a fusion operation. You could figure out how to do endoscopy and offer that to the patient. It's hard not to justify doing the fusion when it makes so much economic sense for all these players in the current setup, in a way, almost taking a hit to do the endoscopic procedure. But in this kind of analysis, if you do it for the right patient and you save the patient a fusion, you get rewarded. And it's just about rewarding the stakeholders for value. And that's why, Michael Porter is the one that pioneered, I think, this idea is that if you compete on value and you're rewarded on value, at the right time scale, everything else sort of falls into place. Motion preservation wins, minimally invasive and endoscopic wins, being conservative wins. Conservative as in like, not being aggressive in what you offer as a treatment option to a surgeon, to a patient. And I think that's like the North Star for all of this. But you have to have the data infrastructure to be able to measure the outcomes and costs that make up value prospectively in real time, longitudinally. And that's the premise behind sort of the software that I've been working to develop and like the research we're doing. I'm reminded of this notion that I can't remember where it was popularized, but it's the idea of a manager versus a leader and what's the difference in the definition. And it gets interchanged a lot. But the analogy is that if you got a team of people and you're cutting your way through a jungle with machetes to get to the other side, the manager is the person that makes sure you have the best machetes, that they're always sharpened, that the right people have the machetes, that there's a process to get you more machetes. How can we build a better machete? And that's a manager. A leader is a person who climbs up one of the trees above the canopy, looks ahead and says, are we even crossing the right jungle to begin with, right? And I actually told this to Scott one of the first times we met. And I was like, that's one of the problems with the spine industry is that all this energy, all this creative talent and like enthusiasm and dollars is getting funneled and almost like force fed into this question of how can we do a fusion better and differently, right? And not asking the question of like, well, should a fusion really is the fusion really like our North Star? Should that what we should be trying to optimize in every case? And I think it's a real problem. Like, and I'm not saying we shouldn't innovate on fusion, but it's a little disproportionate in terms of the amount of energy that gets put into that versus that gets put into motion preserving alternatives like Modus or anything else, or rethinking how a decompression can be done more or less invasively and such.
I think it's been exciting to see, endoscopic surgery start to be talked about more like at conferences. Right. You're seeing a bit more about that. But, we were talking to Dr. Sladicky, and I can't remember if we talked about it in the podcast or just like through conversation, but, you see a bit of motion preservation being talked about at these conferences, but they're small and they're not as well attended.
Right.
And it's just, it's crazy of like, we really are at the beginning of it. It's exciting. And hopefully, in the next 3 to 5 years, it's just going to continue to get bigger. But you're right. It's all based on fusion.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you another, to your question. People have asked, well, why has an endoscopy grown faster? And it's growing fast now, but like historically, why has it been so slow to get adopted? And I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that the industry hasn't invested. Like the big players in the spine industry market have not invested a lot in endoscopy. And the reason is that there's not a lot of money in decompressions, right? And so unless your whole business model is selling the endoscopes and the endoscopic towers or whatnot, there's no implants going in. There's no implants going in. What does Medtronic or whatever else want to do? Now there are implant-based motion preservation options out there, obviously. But I've heard that so many times. And so that's why now that endoscopy is finally getting traction, the next question is, well, can you do an endoscopic fusion?
Yeah.
That's why certain companies are getting into it. It's still, hey, let's offer an endoscopic solution for our surgeons so that we can convince them to do an endoscopic fusion. And now we're just skinning the same cat in a different way. When I see a patient, I mean this wholeheartedly, I ask myself the question, can we get this patient better without surgery, first of all? And secondly, if this patient needs surgery, can I do it in a way that doesn't involve putting metal in their back or their neck? And 3, if we need to put metal in, if we really feel like we need to put metal in, can we do it in a way that doesn't limit their mobility and create problems down the road, right? That's like the 3-step process that I think it's not unique to me, that a lot of conscientious surgeons go through in their mind, but the industry doesn't like that.
Yeah.
That's not the industry's favorite surgeon partner, right? That's not even what the hospitals really want. They want someone like, they want us to be doing fusions 24/7, 365 days a week because the DRG payments are great. And so you have these 2 big elephants in the room, or gorillas in the room, the hospitals and the industry, that both want to see as many fusions as possible. And so that's a big thing to sort of like combat against.
Yeah. To maneuver around. Yeah.
But to bring that full circle, that is why, the time-driven, activity-based costing matters, right?
Yeah.
So you've got these malaligned incentives, but when you can essentially, you're getting something that would be better for the patient, right? Better for the surgeon, better for the payer at the end of the day, right?
Yep.
If you find a way to incentivize those 3 parties, right? Whether it's profit sharing in some way, but that comes from the work that you're doing right now.
Right.
And not on a 3-month scale or a 6-month scale or a 1-year scale. It's on a 5-year scale or a 10-year scale, because that's when the burden to the healthcare system comes up, right?
Totally.
And that's when the burden to the patient comes up. Because the truth of the matter is, we talk about a lot about treating a patient for quality of life versus treating a patient for pain reduction, right? 2 very different things. The truth of the matter is, you go get a fusion done, the chance of you having a pain reduction in that immediate time period, very high.
Yep.
Usually, you go get a good surgery done, it's going to work, right? So in that immediate post-operative period, you're going to feel good whether you get a disc replacement or a total joint replacement or a fusion, right?
Yep.
What are you going to be able to do in 5 years or 10 years?
Yeah.
And to your point, it's about the little things, right? Can I bend down and pay with my grandkid? Can I look behind me to back up the car, right? It's not
Can I swing a golf club?
Can I swing a golf club, right? It's not about like, oh, can I lift like 300 pounds from the ground and be Iron Man? It's about all these daily activities that improve quality of life, that if you get 1 fusion, you might not notice tomorrow, right?
Yes.
But in 5 years, when you get number 2 or number 3, those start to matter, right? But it's all driven by this work that you're doing right now, and how do we show that on a long-term basis and share in all the benefactors that are essentially part of that process.
Right. Absolutely.
So I'm curious, when we're talking about those malaligned incentives, right? How is that a problem that you solve? Because essentially, what you ultimately want to do is, we've got this lag in new technology, right? Or we've got this lag in, getting these new technologies out there. And part of that is, a reimbursement problem for a large part. And it's because we're looking at things on, this short scale.
Right.
How do you go about changing that dynamic so that, people are incentivized to start using, whether it is an endoscopic approach or a motion preservation device. Like, how do you get people to look at that long-term view and start incentivizing, because the first step on the rung is physicians who say, yep, I want to use this thing, right?
Yeah.
And without that, we can't really take the next step.
Right.
So how do you solve, what do you do to solve that?
That's a great question. And then the surgeon's telling this industry partners, hey, I need a better solution for this.
Exactly.
Like, what can you offer me? So I've written a little bit on this, and we've talked about some of this offline with the NTAP, which I thought was fascinating. I learned about it, and new NTAP means new technology add-on payment, through my experience with Carlsmed, actually. So I had heard about Carlsmed and how they were doing these personalized interbody cages, and I was sort of interested in trying it out here at Jefferson. And their implants are expensive, but the way they compensate for that is by saying that, okay, we have won an NTAP, as in the company has won an NTAP, which means that they calculate how much the hospital is going to be losing on a given surgical episode, and a fraction of that loss gets turned into a certain NTAP payment up to a ceiling of, I think in Carlsmed's example, it's like $41,000 or $42,000. And I have zero, relationship with Carlsmed or anything. But I was listening to this and I was shocked. I was like, well, first of all, I was like, so hospitals are losing money on some of these cases? I thought for the most part, elective surgery hospitals make money, but that's not actually true. They do lose money on some of these cases. And so the NTAP is a way that CMS came up with to incentivize the use of implants or treatments that CMS feels will save them money in the long term. That's the whole idea, is that it might be more expensive, so we're going to offset that cost in the short term, because we know that in the long term, if it in one way or another saves costs in the long term, it's good for CMS. And it traditionally, historically, was used for experimental cancer treatments. It might be expensive but worth it, And to my knowledge, there's only 3 companies now that have an NTAP in the spine world. One is Carlsmed, one is SI Bone, and the third one is the Premia Spine for their TOPS facet replacement device. And there may be others that I'm not aware of. Maybe they're small NTAPs, but those are the big ones that I know of. And my big question is, why is this so arbitrary, right? I mean, if a cervical disc replacement, according to most respected large-scale research studies, has a lower reoperation rate than the ACDF counterpart, why shouldn't there be an NTAP for at least new cervical disc replacements that come out? Another example is a company called Miris, which we guys have heard of, which has a really novel alloy and they have a rod that is considered like unbreakable. And so the assumption there is that the reoperation rate for hardware failure should be less. Well, doesn't that fit the criteria that CMS outlined for an NTAP? Why doesn't Miris have an NTAP? And why is it that these industry specific companies have to have like a high-end SWAT team sort of like lobbying firm that knows the right people, I'm guessing, at CMS to be able to lobby in the right way to get the NTAP? And what data is CMS using to decide what the value of that NTAP should be? Are they measuring costs across 5 to 10 years and the outcomes, and then actually putting a thoughtful dollar value on what that NTAP? I don't think so. And so it just seems so arbitrary to me. And I think there's one of 2 ways to go about fixing this. One is that, my joke is there should be like a VTAP, like a value technology add-on payment, where it's like you actually measure this stuff and then you give it to them for the right reasons. Or the NTAP should be like prospectively, the government and private payers should be evaluating all of the new technologies that are coming out there and proactively awarding these payments to solutions that have been shown in the real world to save money in the long term. And one of those things should happen. And if that happened, I think you would see a lot more investment from industry partners in non-fusion options. Because by definition, I think we all agree that a sound motion-preserving alternative to fusion will save money in the long term.
And I'm curious how you see motion preservation devices specifically fitting into that, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about, employer direct. If you're making contracts employer direct, what do they care about? They care about getting people back to work faster, back to work to their baseline, right?
Yes.
And I'm curious if that's a place that you see motion preservation devices fitting in for the long term.
Totally. I think the elephant in the room here is that the industry needs to be incentivized, and also surgeons don't have great incentives to do motion preservation right now because of the way the fee schedule favors fusion. But we know, I think most people that are predicting where healthcare reimbursements are going to go in the next 5 to 10 years are saying that some version of value-based reimbursement is coming down the pipeline, whether it's through Medicare and then private payers following suit, or just the fact that a lot of employers are getting fed up with denials and with cost opaqueness, and they are contracting directly with practices and health systems. And if you're in that situation where you're a surgeon that works in a practice that is doing direct contracts with employers, then you ask yourself the question, well, what do the employers care about the most? Say it's with a large real estate development corporation or construction company where they want their employees to not just have resolution of their leg pain, like as you mentioned, Brady, before, but they want their employees to be at maximum possible physical fitness and function so they can provide the most productivity and value in their job. Suddenly, a motion-preserving alternative to fusion looks really good. And if it's going to cost the employer less in the long run because their odds of a reoperation are lower, it's a total win-win. And if you can make that an argument to an employer, you may actually be able to get a higher reimbursement for a motion-preserving option than for a fusion. Because all the incentives are aligned. And so those kind of novel contracting arrangements, I think, are only going to become more and more popular. And the surgeons who see the writing on the wall and also know it's best for patients in many cases and get comfortable with motion preservation are going to do well. The ones that say, well, hey, look, fee for service right now, fusions are king, let me just stick with that, may find themselves on the outside looking in 10 to 15 years from now.
Well, not only that, something we talk about a lot too is where do patients come into play here? And there's a lot more direct consumer, patient-driven decisions.
Absolutely.
They have information out there. They can go and look you up and see the talks that you've done, the papers you've written, and they will read them. When you're in a place where you're like, I don't want any type of treatment, whether it's, in the spine space or anywhere else, you go and do that.
Yeah. No, I think you're
education
right.
yourself. And then like the patients push for it. This patients want a motion preserving alternative. There is no doubt at all. And so there's that other side of things where patients are going to push. And, like we talked to Dr. Slaticky, and he really mainly only does motion preservation. He does fusion when, that is the only
salvage option.
Yes.
Right.
But he really is like, he's building really one of the very first motion surgery centers.
Absolutely.
And he's like, I have plenty of patients.
Yes.
It's a niche that he's created. Same with Dr. Kachatarian in Salt Lake, where he's the disc replacement center, because that's what patients want. So you also have that side
consumer-driven
consumer-driven,
where we're used to, we're all used to reading up on what we want and going after what we want when it comes to, like you said, a phone or a car or whatever else. And we should have that ability to do that with our own healthcare on our own bodies. And like with the internet and social media and all this, patients will seek out those practices and surgeons and teams that are offering those things. And I'm sure Alex already has people flying from out of town to come get his opinion and a consultation. Maybe sometimes they do need a fusion, but even then, they might go and get their fusion from Alex too, because they know that he has thoughtfully thought about all the options, and that if he's recommending a fusion, it must be because I really need one, and not just because it's the only tool in my tool belt.
And that's what you want as a patient. I think literally the bare minimum is just tell me all of my options. And that should be the conversation that you're having. And then I can make an educated decision. But if I feel like I'm only giving one option, then I'm just in a fearful place of, I don't feel like I'm in a trustworthy space.
And I mean, Mike Wang has made comments like this, and I've thought about it myself as well, which is that, if you have a bad hip, nobody tells you, well, don't get your hip replaced no matter what happens. Stay away. Even if you have a brain tumor, nobody ever says nobody says never get brain surgery. But if you have a back problem specifically, everyone will come out of the woodwork and say, try to avoid back surgery at all if you can, and definitely try to avoid a fusion, right? Like there's nothing else in healthcare that has that type of reputation.
You're so right.
And I do think that is a, overly negative view of back surgery. Obviously it's my, part of my profession. And I think it's also an overly view of back fusions. But part of the reason that we're in this situation is because patients aren't getting the right treatment at the right time for the right reason. And so if you have bad indications, sometimes that leads to bad outcomes. And only now have minimally invasive and endoscopic approaches come to the forefront. That's creating better outcomes. And also it's because people don't want to get on this train where they're going to be worried that when is the other shoe going to drop? I'm going to need the adjacent level fuse and the adjacent level fuse, and then I'm going to need a T10 to pelvis and then a T4 to pelvis and that sort of thing. And so I think it's incumbent upon us in the spine field or anyone that cares about this sort of thing to say, yes, some of the negativity around back surgery is overblown, but some of it is coming from a real position of fear and uncertainty. And anything we can do to innovate and push on motion preservation will help clear that up and provide options that patients feel good about.
Well, I think it's exciting for this next generation of spine surgeons where we are in a place where there is technology now. We have more understanding of the biomechanics of the body that we didn't when fusion first came into play and it was the best option for a very long time.
Yeah.
But I think there's a bigger openness to motion preservation for this next, the younger surgeons like yourself and Dr. Sladicki coming in saying, well, I feel like there's potential for a different way. And I'm willing to go and look at that. And I think it's exciting for 10 years from now, 20 years from now, where hopefully this motion preservation is the standard.
Yeah, right.
I really do believe we're just at that beginning stage right now.
Right, absolutely.
Well, you've been very generous with your time. And
generous.
But so the one thing I do want to get to be able to talk about here at the end, and you've only been in practice a couple of years here, but quickly became the face of Jefferson Health.
Oh, I don't know about that.
No. Let me just. So if you go on YouTube and you want to watch anything on Jefferson Health, there's videos with 200,000 views with Siva's name on them.
Rightfully so. You're so fun to listen to.
Thanks.
Yeah. Absolutely. But what I want to talk about is you're going through a little transition here, right? As well. And I think it is unbelievably exciting for what you're going to get to build here in the future. I want you to be able to talk about it very quickly as we wrap up here.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Yeah. So, first and foremost, I love Jefferson. It was first job out of training. And it's the place where I had the support and infrastructure and foundation to be able to start a lot of this research and put it out into the world, and love Philadelphia and love my partners and are my chairman and everything. But yeah, I'm excited to say that I'll be moving to Naples, Florida, of all places, in a few months. HSS, Hospital for Special Surgery, where I did my fellowship, is starting a new venture in Naples. And they're building a musculoskeletal program in Naples, Florida. And my co-fellow from fellowship and I, Nick Clark and I, are going to be heading up the spine program there.
Wow.
And so it's an exciting opportunity. The main two reasons why I was excited to explore this is, one is that so much of the research that I've been doing around value-based care and cost tracking and how do we reorganize care models right now is sort of in this sort of abstract space. And the opportunity to at least have a small hand in helping design the care models down there in the way that is optimized for value-based care is like extremely exciting. Almost sort of like the modern version of bench to bedside, where it used to be like you want to be able to do micropipetting one day and then be able to actually apply that to real care at the bedside. This is something similar where we're going to be able to have this be like a real world laboratory for best-in-class value-based care practices. And the goal is to make this HSS, so it's partnering with Naples Community Hospital, NCH, so it's going to be HSS at NCH, is that we want to make it the destination for musculoskeletal care in that region and more broadly. And to do that, I don't think it's just about recruiting the best providers. It's also about creating systems and care models and data infrastructure that allows us to be able to track the kind of things that we've talked about today, and also provide an experience for patients where they know if they have any problem in their neck or their back or musculoskeletally, more broadly, that they can come to this entity and make sure that all of the needs and desires around that are going to be taken care of in a comprehensive way, and they can get the best outcome the quickest and at the least expense. And so that's what I'm going to be transitioning to in a few months, and I'm super excited about it.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
That's very exciting.
It's so exciting. And truthfully, it's a testament to you because it brings this whole thing full circle, right? There's two different options. There's doing research for research's sake and publications, and there's doing research for application. And you've got a built out practice here. You've got, you've done very, very well, but you're taking this leap to build something new and build something special that hopefully, what we think is going to change the paradigm of care. Right.
No, thank you. And I have to give special thanks to Dr. Shiraz Qureshi, who was my mentor in fellowship at HSS, who has really spearheaded this, the idea behind this program down in Naples, and given Nick and I the opportunity to go and be the boots on the ground and start it. So thanks so much for your interest and for the opportunity.
Yeah. And Naples isn't a bad place
not
to
too
be.
shabby, right?
Not a bad place to spend time.
Yeah, we're joking that all our friends are going to be coming out of the woodwork and hey, we would love to come visit and that kind of thing. Like,
all of a
absolutely.
sudden, yeah. Well, I can say, putting my patient hat on, healthcare in general is so hard to understand and navigate, and seeing some of this stuff it's a bit scary, but it also makes me really feel better knowing there's surgeons like you and people like you in the space that are really looking at what matters like, this could be fixed because they're smart, caring people like yourself that are taking care of it and looking at it. And I think the practice that you're opening is just even more exciting. I'm like, well, that's where I'm going to go. I'll be getting on a flight to go there if I ever need anything. So
thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, we can't appreciate it enough taking us in here, and we want to get you on your way too. But I'm sure we're going to have many of these talks again. So we're excited for the future.
Yeah.
Thank you,
looking forward to the
Siva.
next one. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Sounds great.
Yeah.